Greetings and welcome to a mini lecture by your favorite Dr. Slater Sarah on the Reascension of African Black Psychology. In this discussion, we'll talk about some of the African diasporic foundations of African Black psychology. And we recall that all of the work that we've done so far has been to set us up for this point where we begin to contextualize what African Black psychology is and how it reemerged. The statement of reemergence of African Black psychology is extremely important because when we discuss reemergence, it's really connected to the fact that African Black psychology has been in existence from the beginning of time. We can consider time frames in ancient Kemet, where we studied Saku, or the soul. And the study of Saku, again, is connected to the modern terminology for psychology. Also, when we deal with this reemergence of African Black psychology, it's critical to understand that African people have been studying the soul, or the psyche, the mind, and what it means to develop into a full person from the beginning of time. And this work is consistent throughout the continent of Africa. It's throughout all of the developmental processes for men and women in things like rites of passage. I might be getting a little bit ahead of myself. But what I want to talk about in this section is how we understand the reemergence of African Black psychology. Now remember, African people have had a significant amount of trauma that has occurred during the enslavement time period, based on where we are now. The trauma of enslavement, meaning rape, violent aggression, stealing, killing, throwing overboard, and there's trauma that occurs. Of course, when anyone experiences things like that, there's trauma that has occurred. So African people have spent millennia attempting to recover from, a couple hundred years, attempting to recover from the trauma that has emerged in the enslavement time period. So African Black psychology is very important because we need tools like African Black psychology to assist us with gathering ourselves and relearning who we are and understanding what forces or what things challenge our identity and our development. So this section, again, is going to give us some insight into what happened for African Black psychology to reemerge in modern times. So let us begin first with this most relevant activities consistent with what we're looking at, an Afrocentric approach to areas of psychology. So although these people were not psychologists per se, they helped to build a foundation for challenging what had become the normative condition for African people, which was enslavement, what's the other term? Sharecropping, like violent, aggression, oppressive behavior. These individuals said that it was important to resist that the enslavement mentality, operating under colonizers, being beaten, whipped, raped, is not a normative condition for African people. So in that instance, we have for people like the great Jean-Jacques Dessalines. Dessalines was extremely important because of his work in the Haitian Revolution and his important part in completing the Haitian Revolution, which was a 13-year war of survival that the Haitian people, who are very beautiful, dynamic, great, and wise people, were being killed at the rate of, what did they say, 26 years old, being worked to death. On average, 26 years old, Haitian people would die because the enslavers were working them so hard. So Dessalines and the Haitian people decided that this was not the way to live. It's not the normative condition for African people. So They fought for freedom. And although Dessalines is not a psychologist, they're one of the key resistors to European enslavement. Second, to Dessalines, we have Nat Turner. Nat Turner again fought for addressing the non-normative condition of enslavement, understanding that African people's place is not one that should not be one of bondage and one of servitude, and quietly or covertly or strategically created a revolution that assisted in challenging the status quo in terms of European enslavement of African people. Denmark Vesey the same way in terms of creating revolts. And these are people who said that we are not destined to be enslaved people, and we're no longer going to accept the condition of enslavement, and fought. Also, we have Harriet Tubman. And Harriet Tubman, or Araminta, was also one who understood that being free was not something that had to be given, but it had to be taken. That freedom had to be established for African people en masse. And although they said she took a couple hundred people, everybody believes, of African descent, believe that she freed thousands and thousands of African people from enslavement, sometimes even having to address the challenges that people have had within themselves of understanding what freedom was and should be for African people. So these are people who maintained a strong sense of true African reality. And again, I can't emphasize enough, they understood that it was not abnormal. This is one of the things we talk about in psychology. It was abnormal for African people to be enslaved. And in that abnormal state, she fought for African people, along with Dessalines. Nat Turner and Denmark Vesey fought for African people to be free. So when we think about this Afrocentric approach to psychology, it is very important to understand how African people should exist. And in this space, I want you to challenge yourself to think about what is a normative condition for African people. It is not one of bondage, enslavement. But what does it mean to truly be African? And we'll address some of that in the subsequent chapters after we get through this particular one. So again, other major markers and milestones in the reascension of African Black psychology occur with Francis Sumner, Herman Kennedy, Edward Blyden, Dubois, and Garvey. So we're going to talk about each one of them because they are major markers. And again, we're still dealing with some who had not helped to we're not necessarily psychologists. We're not necessarily African Black psychologists, but help to build a foundation. But of course, we'll talk about those who were psychologists as well. But make sure that you understand that just as in other fields, people contribute to the foundation or the development of this perspective. In this case, the reemergence of African Black psychology. So African Black psychologists have been doing quite well to challenge how we think and how we see the world, and encouraging African people to look at the world from an African worldview lens. So when we do that, we're able to interpret cultural reality a little bit different. And that's important because that's what some of these individuals were able to establish. So Edward Blyden was very important and one of the most important non-psychologist African scholars. Blyden was important because he gave what I would say an image of one who was well studied, one who was knowledgeable, so they couldn't challenge him, they couldn't come for him. Meaning he was knowledgeable of the European classics, or a master of the European classics. And he could run circles around anybody who challenged him related to anything related to European classics, in addition to being a devout Christian. So, but he also identified himself as a biculturalist. And in his Christianity, he articulated himself as an African Christian nationalist. He wrote a book entitled Christianity, Islam, and the Negro Race, which I have ordered. I encourage you to get. Also, I meant to say to study people like Dessalines. Study, especially if you're Haitian. I shouldn't come up on any Haitian individual, especially young person, college age, who cannot tell me at length about the power of the Haitian Revolution, its significance for African people throughout the world, who Dessalines was, and all of the other players, such as Macandal, in the Haitian Revolution, and how it impacted and brought freedom to African people, and the idea of freedom to African people. All Haitian folks, and I know some of y'all out there checking me out, get your game up and stop playing with me about the Haitian Revolution. Dessalines and all of the bosses, Macandal, everybody. Okay, so I would encourage you to get books and read about those individuals, in addition to reading about Edward Wilmot Blyden. So he was important because Blyden was very important because he gave us context for why we need to understand Africa and African people. So remember, in this time period, we're dealing with post-enslavement. So African people who have transitioned from either positions of slavery, who are in the I was going to say the Americas, but he was born in the West Indies. He lived in Liberia, but he challenged knowledge and understanding of who African people were. His study of the classics, of the European classics, caused him to argue this very important point. If European people have classics, then African people have classics. So our job, he said, as African people, was to study the classics of Africa. That means Sankofa, to go back and fetch that which has been lost, to go to the continent of Africa, or to go to the books that are written on the continent of Africa that are not pejorative, that entertain Africa from an African worldview perspective, and study the beautiful components of African culture, to understand the African classics. So Blyden was extremely important in his emphasis on understanding who African people are. He, recognized the uniqueness of African people, and he strongly advocated for the preservation of the unique characteristics of African people and culture. And we'll talk a little bit more about this later, but if we think about the uniqueness of African people and culture, African people are beautiful, intelligent, like scientific in ways that, and mathematical, like in ways that European culture and other cultures haven't even embraced. When you do a hairstyle, I'm digressing, but when you do a hairstyle that includes mathematical or geometric designs and braiding in the hair, that is dynamic. That is an African classic. And Blyden said that we must understand the unique characteristics of African people and culture. We must find the soul through psyche, through careful study and appreciation of traditional African customs. We have African spirituality, we have African culture, African customs. All of those are very beautiful when you get into it, when you understand it, when you undo the writing that your Rugu has done to your consciousness, then you will be able to more clearly embrace how beautiful African people are and the dynamic components of African culture identity. Blyden believed in the existence and ethos of or worldview of African people, and he argued that the African worldview differentiated from the European worldview, culture, and philosophy. This supported or was substantiated, of course, by Job's two-cradle theory, arguing that African worldview and European worldview are distinctly different. And remember how African people see the world are collective, spiritual, loving of people. And that's important to note that there's a distinct difference. He also proposed the earliest models of African personality. These key components are still used in psychology today. Actually, it builds a foundation for a very key and important foundation for African Black psychology. He additionally articulated the earliest models of cultural oppression. When I tell you Blyden was beast mode all day long, when it comes to African psychology, he identified Eurocentric education of Africans as a cultural miseducation. This is one of my favorite statements. I'm going to say that again. He identified the Eurocentric education of Africans as a cultural miseducation. That means that when African people studied in Eurocentric institutions under Eurocentric ideology, that is cultural miseducation. Because African people were essentially being trained to be or to continue as slaves, as opposed to the challenge that we still have today, as opposed to being trained to think inside our African minds from an African worldview perspective to address the challenges and issues that African people experience and come up with solutions for African sovereignty, solutions for African nation building. So, Blyden also felt that Africans were capable of any achievement, as capable of any achievement as any other race, enslaved or post-enslaved Africans in America, who were painted to be unintelligent, unwise, lazy, all of the things that European people wanted to create and paint this picture of African people. Blyden said that we're brilliant. It's no problem. Educate. And as African people are educated, every achievement that any other group of people can have had, African people, even though we have gone through the trauma of enslavement, will be able to achieve. He advocated for a positivist model of the African biogenetic condition. That means that European people and other people have argued that African genetic condition was bad. Melanin, bad. Wide nose, thick lips, beautiful, round, derriere was considered bad. However, Blyden said and emphasized the importance of melanin dominance. And he argued that African people were, this melanin dominance was important and significant. I just read a counter to this theoretical perspective of melanin dominance. Y'all will have to look into that and share some information with me. I thought it was funny. But they called it extremist, Afrocentric extremism. So, but somehow pairing the term supremacy with non-black people is not a extremist position. Anyway, last one is Blyden advocated for Pan-African nationalism, and he organized around blackness. So again, Blyden, you gotta look at, get his book. He was in beast mode. I was trying to make this a mini, but okay. Dubois, William Edward Burghardt Dubois, 1868 to 1963. He lived a good little life. He argued that African people were the seventh born son, born with a veil. One of the reasons why Du Bois is important is because he was able to place some of the challenges in terms of consciousness. Remember, this is building the foundation for the reemergence of African Black psychology. He built the foundation for understanding who African people were, Black people, and he suggested that African people were the seventh born son. And the seven sons included Egyptian, Indian, Greek, Roman, Teuton, and Mongolian, and then Negro. He argued that the seventh born son was born with a veil, meaning that African people had this, had to battle their identity, being two souls, two thoughts, two warring ideals in one dark body. African people had to struggle with one being subservient, but also being brilliant, not being able to reveal the brilliance because having to placate to what European people identified or revealed that African people should be. And he said that this caused a double consciousness, or this challenge of double consciousness in African people. African people had to be both Black and American, and that challenged the African psyche, but it was very important. I'm going to come back after we, in a moment, to this slide. He was one of the first Black persons to receive or be awarded, degree from one of the Ivy League schools. My Jegna, which is Baba Kobe Cambon, who wrote the text, African Black Psychology in the American Context, would always have me cracking up in class when he talked about Dubois. Because he argued that, or he jokingly said that African people felt that it gave him some sense of higher or better identity, or being more significant than other people who graduated from places like HBCUs, because he graduated from, he would say, Harvard, in that African people somehow made that Ivy League degree significant. But what's most important is what you do for African people, whatever degree you get from whatever school. So Du Bois did his job, and he was important in building the foundation for looking at ourselves. This double consciousness he argued in terms of this double consciousness phenomena, that African people had to look at ourselves through the eyes of others, that we currently, to this day, still see ourselves, African people, see ourselves through the eyes of European people, because we have been indoctrinated to understand how they see us and how they interpret us. When we get to a place where we can put on what I identify those African worldview lens and see the world from our cultural perspective, we have so much beauty, so much power to actually get to. So, Du Bois's important works was The Soul of Black Folks and Dark Water, Voices from the Veil. I'd encourage you, if you're a book reader, to get these books and again read. Du Bois was great. So the seventh born son, born with a veil, I thought was interesting, because he put the black person down here on at the bottom. Remember, I said I was going back. But if we study African Black psychology or African culture, we know that the Egyptian was African, Kemetic, dark skin, Black African. So were we really the seventh born? Okay, moving on. Marcus Mosiah Garvey was very important and significant to African people. Nana Marcus Garvey Garvey said, "Look for me in the whirlwinds. When I die, I will come back as a terror." Meaning that death for African people isn't death, which we study in chapter, I'm going to say 1, that we studied in chapter 1. That in African cosmology, when you die, your physical body is gone, but your spirit continues to exist. So Garvey brought Africanness in everything that he did. He argued Africa for the Africans. He was a leader of and founder of the UNIA, the Universal Negro Improvement Association, in the 1920s. And this was he was one of the most significant personalities of the UNIA. But why Garvey was beast mode all day long was because Garvey argued that we had to create in businesses, institutions, manufacture our own goods. But in addition to talking about it, Garvey did it. He led the movement of Black nationalism. In terms of this building movement, Garvey had the newspaper, The Black World. He had the ship, the Black Star Line. And the idea of buying bonds for going back to Africa. He actually began to collect monies, the organization, for African people to go back to Africa. African people were at this time developing into what my elders call race people, who emphasized the power and significance of the race. Garvey said that we have money within the Black community, and that instead of giving money out of the Black community. We should keep it inside the Black community and recycle our money amongst each other and build for ourselves. And he actually did that. Garvey had African people marching in the thousands in the streets, suited and booted, looking fly, because he wanted to build an army of African warriors, but those who understood the importance of nationalism for African people. It notes down here that there's a quiz on the film. I didn't delete that, but you might have a quiz after this. Marcus Garvey was so important and significant that he argued Africa for the Africans. There was a time where African people recycled money within the African community before we began to go out to all of the large conglomerates. At that time, giving money in the community built and strengthened the community. So now African money goes out of the community, so there's no resources or income in the community. So today I challenge you to do something important. And in your comments, list a Black business that you have supported. List a Black business that you plan on supporting. List a product that put the link in the little chat thing, like, subscribe. I don't know. Don't subscribe. I know that's weird. But like and put in the chat Black businesses so we can start or restart giving our money back to our people, or at least making it recycle in the community 6 times. They said in back in the day that money in the Black community used to recycle 6 times in the community before it went out of the Black community. What that means for us at this point is at least try to spend some money amongst African people. There are African businesses everywhere. Look it up. And then give money to your people before you give money to somebody else. Yes, there are challenges with Black businesses. Yes, Black businesses have to charge more money. But if you think about why, African people have been written out of access to resources. So it takes Black people more, costs more, Black African people more to produce, so they have to charge more to get a living wage. So be considerate of that, because I know some of y'all brothers will buy these belts that are like, I don't know, I've seen brothers pay $300 for these gold belts. So y'all got money. Spend it in the Black community. That's Marcus Garvey's word. And make sure that you understand the importance and significance and power in giving your money into your community. Sumner, Francis Cecil Sumner, was also next, and he begins our discussion of psychologists. But he was the first Black person to receive a PhD in psychology from Clark University. He caused white folks to reevaluate the idea of African people being primitive and inferior because of his academic prowess. Okay. He was intelligent and brilliant. And he also gave psychological training by training the largest number of Black psychologists in this country at Howard University. Big up to my Howard family. Okay. But Rattlers rule. All right. He identified the European worldview as a basic contradiction. And in his work, he talked about this need to evaluate the idea of the white man's burden doctrine. The white man's burden doctrine argued, I think we talked about this a little bit before, argued that African people somehow are a burden for European people. The African people were struggled with being civilized. European people said African people were uncivilized. And in that statement of African people being uncivilized, European people had to come in and save the African. Not giving credence to this very intricate and dynamic culture in Africa, order in Africa, survival of African people, thrival of African people, in everything African people did, including building government, institutions, libraries, technology, pyramid. I mean, You name African people did it, and integrated math into the hairstyles. So he argued that we had to address this idea because African people have had things for the beginning of time. Some people would argue before European people came into existence. So, again, the European worldview as a basic contradiction, especially to the African. African people should not look at the world from a European worldview perspective. If you do, then you emphasize, based on Camp Bond's work, the European survival thrust. If you emphasize the European survival thrust, you won't be able to do what Garvey said, which is support African people and the African community and support an African survival thrust. If you operate from a European worldview, then you think that beauty is long, stringy hair. You will then, sisters, buy and glue onto your hair wigs with lace fronts, putting your makeup on to give the appropriate transition, so that you will look like the European, in addition to the makeup. And then you will think that that is the standard of beauty. So that's a challenge. And Francis Cecil Sumner argued that we have to take a look at that. We'll continue with in the next unit, discussions on other folks who were instrumental in the reascension of African Black psychology. Again, I'm Dr. Slater Sarah. Peace.